You're listening to a download from the outdoorstation.co.uk. Number 387.
Hello and welcome back to number 387 with me, your host, Bob Cartwright. This is the second in the two-part interview with Jasper Winn, where we discuss his 500-mile winter walk from Munich to Paris, which took place during November and December 2014. The premise of the walk was to replicate, 40 years on, the one undertaken by Werner Herzog in his book On Walking in Ice, where, for some reason, he decided to walk from Munich to Paris to visit a friend, Lotte Eisner, who had been struck down by a dire, horrible illness, in the hope she would still be alive, because he had walked from Munich to Paris. Yes, I know, totally bizarre, but that's Herzog for you. I wouldn't recommend it if you like travel journals, let's just say. It's the size of a pamphlet, it's completely off the wall, incoherent most of the time, and therefore, as you might imagine, it is classed as an introspective masterpiece which received a literary award. We pick this up as Jasper was reflecting on the distinctive difference that Germany and France have to walking for recreation or for travelling. There is, of course, more photos, images and links on the outdoorstation.co.uk, as well as the website associated with the walk, theslowadventure.com. It does actually make us reflect, us as in the UK, just what an infrastructure we have with the maintenance of our bridleways and footpaths. The more that this experience you're having is noted by people, the more they might appreciate what we've got, certainly in this country.
I think so, and I think the Germans are great walkers, the French not so at all. I saw very few French walking for anything other than a purpose in their mind. So lots of people foraging for free food, so effectively mushrooms at that time of the year for fungi. So many people out hunting. I mean, the great religion in the east of France, in rural France, is boar and deer hunting. And it was like going back to the Second World War. I'd wake up in forests and there'd be lines of people I could hear in the distance with dogs just moving through. And then you'd hear a fusillade of shots. I wouldn't say it was frightening, but I did note that nearly everybody walking out in rural France was wearing a high-vis jacket. I've got some experience of shooting, and normally, something comes out, one person takes one shot at it. But in France, it just seems like everybody has a shot at whatever moves. So that was quite, again, it was obviously such a huge cultural part of rural France was the chasse, these great hunts, which it seemed to employ everybody, either beating or actually out hunting or whatever. Some of them were just small groups of local men, very sort of parochial, if you like. Others were obviously great, massive commercial drives for very well-off people. And that animated every weekend. But then during the rest of the week, I could walk for hours on end and see nothing but cars. Germany was a bit different. A lot more people walk for leisure there. But still, compared to Britain, very few, really. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's the symbiotic relationship between the amount of off-road walking that there is in Britain and the number of people who use it. Has created a very different landscape to walk through.
Let's have a bit of a talk about the aspect that I really wanted to get into, really, which is the wild camping, because it's familiar over here with where we stand and what we can and can't do. And obviously, from a land access point of view, you do know that if you're in England, generally, if you go onto a farmer's land, you've got a fair chance of him not being very pleased about it and approaching you in whatever way. How was it perceived, or how were you received doing what you were doing in the French and the German side? Are people fairly lax because of the environment that you were going through, and they were fairly nobody was really bothered about the land and you passing over it? Or because you were unusual and you were walking through, did it attract more attention from that point of view?
I do a lot of wild camping and hole-in-the-wall camping and bivvying. So I've got quite a lot of caution about it. I mean, it's even less popular in Ireland. There are almost no places you can legally camp out in Ireland. And so one always either has to ask or one has to make very sure it's not found. And I do a lot of wild camping and hole-in-the-wall bivvying on long walks in England as well. So I knew I was going to camp out every night. And I knew I was going to camp wild or just find a place to stay. I was very cautious. I don't think anybody ever stumbled across me in the whole month of walking. I always made sure I was well hidden, and all my stuff is green, and I'm able to disappear into the woods. But the other thing was, there are immense areas of woodland in both Germany and in France. You've only got to walk off a path for even a couple of 100 yards, and you're hidden and lost to all eyes. Even if anybody was going to pass. But I started off being quite cautious about even letting people know that I was camping out. And then I realized, in fact, that nobody really seemed to care. People rather assumed I was. And I never actually found out what the legal situation was, either in Germany or in France. But certainly the general feeling from farmers, I suppose I always told people I was going to be walking on for another hour or two. So farmers always assumed I wasn't going to be camping on their land. So perhaps it's a bit of a NIMBY thing. But no, I would just keep walking until I found somewhere good. And I had both a hammock and a bivvy. So it was warmer down on the ground. You lose a lot less heat. Obviously, you could pile up leaves to make a mattress or anything. And I was really worried about staying warm enough at night. I began with not enough kit, and I added a fiber pile fleece to wear when I was sleeping as well. But I was still pretty on the edge, especially on cold nights, especially up in the mountains. And if there was any wind, or if I picked a bad place in where there was when you get cold water pooling into a dip, then those extra few degrees down made the night miserable. But then the hammock was fantastic if I was in wet ground, of which was a lot. I mean, several times I ended up sleeping in land that was so waterlogged that even if I stood there for a few minutes, I was an inch down into the mud within a few minutes. And so then the hammock gave me this opportunity just to swing myself up above all the dampness. And both of them are quite low key, low visibility.
So when you were coming through the more populated areas, villages or towns, did the opposite happen? Did the feeling of being tracked, as it were, and actually wanting to just get in and get out as soon as possible overcame you? And certainly when you were, I'm ignoring Munich, because obviously you just wanted to get out of Munich fairly quickly, but the closer you got to Paris, I presume, the more populated the area became. And because obviously it's a sort of commuter belt, were you starting to struggle then finding places to wild camp? And did you sort of use the natural paths that were shown on the maps, or were you making your own way?
No, you're absolutely right. There were some areas, and it was getting towards Paris where it became more and more difficult. From Troyes on to Paris, wild camping was harder. It was much more difficult to find places. Not because it was so built up, not until I got very close to Paris, within the last 40 or 50 miles, but because the farming was much more intense. And there were less little kind of woodlands, little spinneys, little copses to disappear into. And people were still working the land quite often late into the evening. And that just makes the whole thing a lot more difficult. But I'd also, I suppose, had a lot more practice. I mean, every night I'd been finding somewhere to camp. And you must know this as well. Your eye tunes in. In fact, I'd even find myself sort of by late morning seeing a particularly good place and thinking, gosh, I wonder if we should stop now and just start really early tomorrow to make up for it. Mm-hmm. And finding something like a hunter's hut up in the mountains, or in Germany, there were occasionally refuges which were open, and that just made all the difference. Those were luxury nights. knowing that, if it rained, I was still fine. Could stand up and, and cook properly without having to squat up behind a tree. So it was a real luxury to find any kind of a shelter like that. I did, I think break-in is a bit strong because they were all open, but I did sleep in a couple of barns in Herzog fashion. And I have to say they weren't great nights because I was always worried about being discovered. And I just felt that it was going to test both my very poor German and my not quite so poor French, having to argue with there was no argument, there was no leg to stand on, but having a discussion, a frank discussion with some irate farmer at 5 a.m. And then the very last bit, my last night out, I slept in a park right in the heart of Melun. It was a very foggy night, and I actually felt because bad weather means people aren't out and about. The places you couldn't have slept during the summer, A, because it's lighter, B, because people are out and about. I actually managed to sleep in quite safely and quite unbeknownst to anybody, because it was dark at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and because the weather kept people indoors.
Did I not read somewhere on your blog that somebody attempted to mug you somewhere? Was that in Paris or Munich?
Oh, that was the very last day in coming into Paris. I walked just over 40 miles on the last day, and precisely for the reason you say, is I couldn't see an obvious or easy place or safe place to camp once I was within the sort of the environs of Paris. Herzog also did the same thing. He walked 50 miles on his last day and night. He just walked solidly for 30-odd hours until he reached the center of Paris. I wasn't quite that driven, but I used the maps to find a slightly circuitous route that effectively followed the Seine right into the very heart of Paris, to Notre Dame. And it was a long, long, hard day. I was tired. My shin had finally blown up, and I was just within probably 300 yards of Notre Dame, which was my nominal finishing point. And some guy tried to mug me, and I think to his huge surprise, he was quite a large guy, and I still wouldn't. I have no idea what he was thinking. Whether he thought I was a kind of down and out, and it was just going to be fun to knock me to the ground and kick me around a bit, which would have been very unpleasant. Or whether he actually thought, there's a guy walking along, he looks like an easy mark, and he's probably got a camera and a few bob in his back pocket. Anyway, I think he hadn't reckoned with the fact that I'd walked 500 miles to get to Notre Dame, and I wasn't going to be thwarted in the very last 100 yards or 200 yards. And it all ended surprisingly for everybody. I did Aikido a long time ago, and I was very pleased to find that subconsciously I must have remembered a little bit from the classes.
Muscle memory is good, eh?
It's exactly that. I was actually talking to the guys I was last doing Aikido with about that, and saying, look, I haven't been practicing, I haven't done this for years. And they just said, yeah, but when push comes to shove, your muscle memory is there, exactly as you say. And it was just one nice straightforward move to knock his hands off my throat, and another one to push him back. And it didn't. The great thing about Aikido is you don't actually hurt the other person, so he didn't feel the need to come and beat me up. He was just very surprised, and so was I.
It's made it a very interesting end reading your blog, certainly. Going back to the mountains just briefly, when you cross those, we've just sort of glossed over it very, very quickly. But when you cross those, did you take a sort of a mountain footpath over them, or did you sort of take the more commercial thoroughfare, which was close to the main road in case there were issues?
No, I did. I looked at the maps, and there were long detours. I have to say that Herzog and his journal, which I was still reading, not as a guidebook, obviously, and not even really to indicate the route, because I'd actually veered away from his route on numerous occasions for days on end, for weeks at one point, or for over a week at one point. But he had talked about going straight over the Schwarzwald, over the Black Forest Mountains. I looked at the map, and I thought I could see a better route. than he took, because he started off into it, decided, in fact, it was easier to follow the road and do a dog leg. And I thought I could beat him. And it was an interesting experience. I mean, I have to say, it was one of the nicest days of all. But once I got up into the mountains beyond Hornberg, I could see where I wanted to go, and I could find forestry tracks that were going roughly in the right direction, but they would then reach a deep contour line and just stop dead or double right back on themselves. So in fact, I spent a very, very happy day and a half wandering around in the Schwarzwald. And if I'd been on a walking holiday, as it was bright autumnal sun, and I found a refuge that I could camp out in halfway across, I'd have been absolutely thrilled. But as it added probably another 8 hours of walking and whatever that translates to in miles, it actually, discretion quite often on that kind of trip is the better part of valor. I learned the hard way that very often the dull, boring road, even if it dog-legged or zigzagged, was invariably faster than going straight across country. It's sort of obvious, especially in Germany, that they've looked at every conceivable way from getting from A to B, and they'll have worked out the best way, the least effort, and then put a road there. So I enjoyed that kind of navigation, but invariably trying to shortcut across mountains always took me more time than just following the road. But it was much more pleasant, so I did it.
The Outdoors Station is a free media entertainment service dedicated to the self-powered outdoors enthusiast.
And so what would you say you've learned most of all from doing this trip, having put it off for best part of 10 years, I guess, and hoped to plan to do it? Now you've actually undertaken it, even in the style you did, sort of without all your technical equipment that you left behind in Ireland. What's the big thing that you've actually learned about it, and how would you apply that to one of your next adventures?
That's a really good question, because I normally do these trips. I sort of kayak around Ireland, or I ride across South America on horses. And at the end of it, I actually haven't learned anything much. And this was a surprising trip to do, because in many ways, it's not an adventurous terrain. It's it's the heart of Europe. At any point, I was probably never more than, even at the most remote place, I was probably never more than 4 hours of walking from, as they call it, definitive health. It wasn't like being lost in Patagonia or marching around in the Atlas Mountains. Yet, because of the season and because of where I was walking and the way I was walking, it, in fact, in many ways, felt a lot more remote than other trips I've done. It was also very hard psychologically at times to keep going, knowing that, in fact, very often when I was in a village, knowing I could just jump on a bus. It seemed a bit pointless initially. So it was hard to keep going psychologically. It was such a random trip. And as I say, on either side of me all the time, people were living perfectly normal lives and would have been astounded at the idea that somebody was struggling along cold, wet, and hungry. But what it did, at the end of it, I realized that I both needed a lot less kit than I've ever carried, and I appreciate good kit a lot more than I did before. It sounds paradoxical. It was a great thrill to find that, like millions of people all over the world, you don't need the very best of boots or the very best of gear to do something. It should never stop one heading off on any kind of a trip. I mean, most of my stuff I got out of a charity shop just before I left, and it was perfectly adequate. But what one does appreciate at the very same time is that when stuff is good, it really is good. There's one thing that's been with me. It's a titanium mug, one of the ones I'm sure that you know only too well, that people rave about. Gosh, what a great little bit of kit that is. Absolutely rock solid. And it was a real comfort knowing that it was going to be there every night to make soup with. I could put it on a little fire and it would burn up. Things like that. I had some really good socks. So just these little things, the comfort didn't make, yeah, I would have managed to get through if I didn't have those nice things, but they did make life a lot more comfortable. So I came out paradoxically knowing that I need less kit than I usually carry, but appreciating good kit far more than I ever did before.
And so where does the whole story of the journey take you now? Do give us the name of the blog so people can actually look it up in more detail, and what you're planning to do with your journal.
Well, I did blog on the trip. I've got a site called The Slow Adventure, which is musings on everything from making walking sticks to the pros and cons of hammock camping all over the world. But it became the vehicle for pretty much a daily blog for the whole trip. And it's called theslowadventure.com. So there's an account of the trip on that. It wasn't going to be a book. I was working on another book before I set off, but that's been pushed to one side because I realized that as I was walking, that not only was I able to reflect on the difference that 40 years had made between the time that Herzog had walked the trip and when I had walked the same route, but also it had taught me a lot more about why I like walking. Herzog seemed, because he was on a mission, seemed to have had a pretty miserable time of it. For him, it was an ordeal. I think he created an ordeal out of a lot of it. And I was wondering if that was going to happen to me. But in fact, I enjoyed, I would say, every day of the trip, unreservedly, every night of the trip. There were a few bleak hours along the way. And so I wanted to write, and I'm writing right now, an account of my trip from my journal at the same time, which is really a kind of an antidote of walking in ice. Mine is so much more of walking in the sunny upland joyfully. And it is a chance to have seen bits of Germany and bits of France, which, why would one ever go there for any other reason except a random straight line took me through? And I like that kind of random literature anyway. I like books about walking, so I thought I should inflict another one, add to the number.
Well, we can only wish you well with that, and obviously if people keep an eye on your blog site, they will be aware of when it goes live, if that comes in the near future. As usual, I'd like to have a nice little question at the end to throw in, so let's try this one. Of all the things I could have asked you about your journey, what should I have asked you?
Oh, that's a clever question. Gosh, that's almost Herzogian in its lateralness. Well, the obvious ones are, would I do it again? To which the answer would be no, but I would certainly do another similarly random trip. What I think I liked about that trip was the essential randomness of it. Herzog only walked to Paris because that's where Lottie Eisner was living when she was dying. And by the way, she did live for another 9 years, I think, or even more, after he got there. Whether that was his pilgrimage and intervention that made the difference, I don't know. But I did think, perhaps if she'd been dying in Rome, it would have been a very different trip. Munich to Rome is about the same distance. It would have been up over the Alps and then a rather joyful trip down through Italy. Yes, I mean, if you were to ask me, would I do it again? The answer would be, well, not that trip, but I would happily and joyfully set off on another trip that was such a random thing. It was something the dice man might have thrown up. So, for that reason alone, I'm grateful to Herzog for having proved the inspiration for something that I would never have done otherwise.
Do you think the wild camping and the principle of wild camping and the association that it has with freedom, and in particular people that commute or used to commute on foot for work as well as pleasure, do you think it's a sad thing to see that slowly disappear?
I don't know if the wild camping side is disappearing. I actually think there's quite a renaissance in that. I suspect that almost by definition, people are quite cautious about saying how much they sleep out and sleep wild. I mean, I quite often write about trips for journals and for magazines, for newspapers, and I very rarely put into print that I wild camped a particular trip. just because it's one of those things I think that one discovers for oneself. It doesn't help to publicize it. So I think there are actually more people, I think you must know as well, you must know a lot of people who are clandestinely wild camping left, right and centre. And if one's good at it, nobody ever knows. I think what's much more depressing, really, is, as I was saying, that the fact that the car now is king, the number of people who drive to go on a walk. That's what I liked about this, the nuttiness of walking from one capital city to the next, not following a particular trail. A lot of the walking was dull and boring. It was the kind of walking that people have done for millennia, since humanity became bipedal. And I liked that. And it felt like an act of civil disobedience. There was plenty of enthusiasm for me if I was walking on some marked trail, because that's what happens. You mark a trail and people drive there and they walk around it, often for days on end. But the idea that you might just walk from one place to the next was gratifyingly upsetting for quite a lot of people. And gratifyingly, it would seem, inspiring to some people. And a lot of what I'm writing about is the reaction that telling people I was walking to Paris from Munich, how that affected people, the kind of people who warmed to that idea, and the kind of people who drew back and felt it was some kind of act of civil disobedience. I should have been on a car or using some kind of motorized transport or on a train or something like that. So I like that idea, and I think that's probably what's threatened more than wild camping. Wild camping is per se frowned upon, so therefore we're quite good at it. Whereas walking is being shunted into this leisure-only activity. Well, gosh, what a great leisure activity it is. But there's nobody out there that I could see who was just walking long distance, unless they're particularly bizarre. Unless there's somebody like Werner Herzog for his own bizarre reasons, or somebody like me for my own bizarre reasons.
In this particular trip, I take it, and you certainly haven't mentioned it, so I presume you actually didn't meet any other people that were wild camping for whatever reason, leisure or otherwise.
No, I didn't meet anybody else at that time. And that was, as I was saying earlier, was a factor not of the landscape, but of the season. I used to do a lot of trips when I was researching transhumance, the moving of cattle or goats or sheep or whatever it is, up and down mountains, which happens all over Europe, all over Africa, all through South America, all through Central Asia. Worldwide, people have been changing their seasons by going up and down mountains with their stock. And this was something like a similar kind of transhumance. It was the same landscape, but in November and December, it was a completely different world to if I'd been walking in June or July. Then it would have been full of people. There was all kinds of infrastructure there for leisure walkers that just, when it's raining and miserable and the nights are long and the days are short, just isn't used. So just creating an adventure, or a spirit or a feel of adventure by changing when one walks, that was exciting to find that one could still find a very different, a challenging Europe just by going at a certain time of the year.
Well, Jasper, it's always good to talk to you, so thank you very much indeed for taking the time out of your writing to give us the behind-the-scenes story relating to this. And I did want to speak to you at this time of year because people would remember what it's like being a bit wet, cold and miserable, and obviously undertaking a trip like this in this kind of weather because we're surrounded by it at the moment. So it's been fascinating to, as you say, hear a modern-day adventure not exactly where you would expect it to be.
It was very good talking to you, as always.
You can hear more from Jasper Winn and one of his previous adventures on podcast number 341 and 342. His books are far more entertaining and informative than Herzog's, and I'm sure if one comes out of this adventure, it'll be much easier going. Jasper was hoping to come to the Lightweight Outdoor Show we're organising in Malvern in April and meet ourselves and everybody else, but sadly he won't be able to make it. He's otherwise engaged on the 25th, which is a great shame. It would have been fun to watch him get all excited by all the lightweight kit he'd be surrounded by like a kid in a sweet shop. However, that's not to be, unfortunately. Thanks for listening, everyone. Please do feel free to drop me a line at our email address, info@theoutdoorstation.co.uk, or leave a comment on the Outdoors Station website or, of course, on the Facebook group. So, until next time, folks, ready for our next Wild Camp Challenge. And then, of course, the one after that is with Mr. Book of the Bivvy himself, Ronald Turnbull. So we've got quite an exciting couple of months ahead of us. Until then, take care out there, and bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To hear or see more from our extensive free library, please visit theoutdoorstation.co.uk.